Welcome to this event. Those of you who were born before 1980 might remember how such events have been announced on German television. Meine sehr verehrten Damen und Herren, herzlich willkommen im Saal und draußen an den Bildschirmen. My name is Lars-Gerrit Lüßmann. I'm a corporate partner in the Frankfurt office and co-lead of Gowling WLG in Germany. I'm delighted to welcome you to this afternoon's conference, Doing Business in Canada, which we jointly host together with the BUJ, the Bundesverband der Unternehmensjuristen. And I'm particularly delighted to welcome Dr. Patrick Otto and Dr. Peter Henke as representatives of the BUJ here in our office today. Welcome. Gowling WLG is a global 100 law firm with Canadian and UK roots. We have more than 1,500 lawyers distributed equally on both sides of the pond. And a year and a half ago, we just opened the Frankfurt office, where we today have, together with our colleagues in Stuttgart, almost 40 lawyers now. The event today is a testament to our deep and widespread Canadian roots. And I'm very happy that the BUJ organized this together with us today. So welcome, everybody. And now I pass on to Dr. Henke. Welcome again, and hope we have a great session.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lüßmann. My dear colleagues, a warm welcome to everybody. And great to have you here. So we're doing this in English today, obviously, because of the subject matter, of course, also. We're very grateful to have this session here at the premises of Gowling WLG. And thank you very much for inviting us and for having us. That's a great opportunity. We are very proud and very grateful to have you on board as our new sponsoring partners since September 1st this year already. And we are looking forward in doing many interesting sessions together and to learn a lot from each other. So the credo of the BUJ is of the practice for the praxis, and this is what we're trying to do. And we are very interested to learn about how things are in practice in doing business in Canada. And so therefore, I hand it over to you, Mr. Wittinghofer. Thank you very much for having us, and have a great time together.
Thank you, Mr. Henke. Good afternoon also from me. My name is Matthias Wittinghofer. I'm a litigation and arbitration partner in our Frankfurt office here in Germany. I would like to take the pleasure of accompanying you through the first part of our program today. And it gives me great pleasure to hand over the baton immediately to our Canadian partner, Todd Burke from Ottawa. Todd, of course, is a partner in our litigation and arbitration department, where he handles complex international disputes. And he is also a member of our international board, the highest representative committee of our firm. Todd, thank you for being here, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Matthias. Certainly, it's a pleasure for us to be here and to have this wonderful opportunity to speak to members of the BUJ. I thought it might be interesting to start with a little bit of a humorous, serious introduction about Canada and what Canada actually is. People, places, and phrases. I thought we would introduce Canada through that mechanism. So as you know, Canada is a very vast country. We have 10 provinces and 3 territories, and our population is 41.2 million people. But what you may not know is that we have the largest population of moose in the world. Now, our population is about 1/2 of Germany's population, but we have 27 times the land area. And to give you a sense of the size of Canada, my partner David Petrus told me that if you flew from Victoria in British Columbia to St. John's, Newfoundland, it would take about 7 hours. And if you fly from Toronto to Frankfurt, it's about 7 hours and 45 minutes. So it's a very, very big country. Now, our national sport, our national obsession is hockey. All right. So Germany has contributed to Canada's national sport because we are very lucky to have some very talented German hockey players. So I'm from Ottawa. I'm a fan of the Ottawa Senators, and we have Tim Stützle playing for us, a star in Ottawa, and of course Leon Draisaitl in Edmonton, and we have Moritz Seider. He's from Detroit. He's playing for the Detroit Red Wings. So you've got a great German contribution to our national sport. If we could just move through. There's Mo Seider, and we're going to go ahead. All right. So we thought we would just tell you a few Canadian phrases. Now, the most famous of Canadian phrases is probably "a." So you may say, well, what is "a"? And it really, if we can go to the next slide, it means, don't you think? So aren't we going to have a great program, eh? Don't you think we're going to have a great program, eh? So that's a Canadian phrase. A Canuck, to the next slide, means a Canadian. So we've got 15 Canucks participating in today's presentation. And then there's the word kerfuffle. Now that's kind of a funny word. If we go to the next slide, it means commotion. So we're hoping that this program does not create a kerfuffle today. And of course, go to the next slide. Everybody wants to show you a photograph from their phone. And I thought I would give you 3 photographs from my phone just to show you the diversity and beauty of our country. So the first one is in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and that's on the East Coast. Great maritime tradition. We'll go to the next slide. That's the big city of Toronto, 4th largest city in North America. And as you can see, the home of the Toronto Blue Jays. And we go to our next slide. And of course, Canada is known for its rugged wilderness and outside activities. And this is a picture that I took in Squamish, British Columbia, and that's just north of Vancouver. And we'll go to our last slide. We could move on. A little bit about who we are. And Lars has talked a little bit about who we are internationally. But we, in Canada, have 7 Canadian offices. So in Vancouver, British Columbia, in Calgary, Alberta, in Waterloo and Hamilton, Ontario, in Toronto, and in Ottawa, and also in Montreal. And we have in Canada over 700 lawyers just in Canada. And of course, providing legal services in a variety of sectors and a variety of interesting areas. So a little bit about Canada, a little bit about who we are. I thought we would do that in a little humorous way. So there's your foundation, and we'll move on, Matthias.
Before we do, Todd, one question. What's your favorite place, your most favorite place in Canada, and why?
Well, my most favorite place in Canada is Newfoundland. And Newfoundland is in the far east of Canada, and I am a Newfoundlander. I was born in Newfoundland. And if you go there, you'll be absolutely captivated by 2 things: by the beauty along the coast. It's a sort of the fjords of Norway, but transported into North America. So it's beautiful. But its greatest asset is its people. Now, I don't say that just because I'm from Newfoundland, but I say it because everybody there is so open and friendly. They're just beautiful people. And if you have the opportunity to go to Newfoundland and Labrador.
Thank you so much. That's a good piece of advice. Thank you, Todd. We're now turning to our next presenter, which is Jacques Shore. Jacques, of course, is a partner in our Ottawa office, and he's dialing in live from Ottawa right now. Jacques is a partner in our advocacy group, and he specializes in federal regulatory matters. And Jacques is going to talk to us about the Canadian political landscape against the backdrop of the recent US general election. Certainly an issue that is of interest to all of us. Jacques, are you there? And can you hear us? I thought this was going to be a rhetorical question. Jacques, this is Frankfurt calling. Okay. Seeing as we seem to be having trouble reaching Jacques, why don't we turn to André Bergeron? André, are you there? And would you be willing to talk to us about the economic landscape in Canada now? André, if you're there, I'll say a few words about you.
Hello, yes, I'm here.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. André, of course, is a partner and economist hailing from our Ottawa office, and he is a partner in our tax dispute group. André, over to you, please.
Guten Tag, and thank you for the invitation to speak to you today. Today, I'll provide an economic and statistical overview of Canada and comparing it with Germany and exploring some economic interplay between these countries. So next slide, please. I think we'll have to advance a couple over Jacques. Another one. And another one. Thank you. So first, Todd mentioned earlier in the presentation that Canada's population now sits at 41.2 million. So interestingly, 25 million Canadians reside in the provinces of Ontario and Quebec, and 2/3 of that population lives within a 100-kilometer strip along the border with the United States. In comparison, Germany's population is approximately 84 million, meaning Canada has about half the population of Germany. We were also talking earlier about how big Canada is. So geographically, Germany is closest in size to the province of Manitoba, and you could fit Germany twice in Manitoba. Overall, though, Germany's landmass is just 1/28 of Canada's, highlighting the vast differences in geographic scale. So let's talk about unemployment. Canada's unemployment rate is steady at 6.5%, which is up from the lows of 4.6% observed coming out of the pandemic in June and July of 2022. This marked the lowest level since 1976. I also note that recently, the employment is up 303,000 jobs year over year. So let's talk about the gross domestic product. So that is up 0.5% in the second quarter of 2024, recovering from recent lows of minus 0.1% in 2022. However, on a per capita basis, GDP is still relatively low, showing a decline of 0.1%, indicating the economy is not keeping pace with our population growth. Inflation has been a concern globally, as you've seen in Europe and in North America, and Canada has not been spared. At one point in June 2022, inflation was up to 8.1%. However, inflation now sits at 1.6% year over year, finally brought under control by the Bank of Canada's monetary policy, which aims to maintain inflation between 1% and 3%. So speaking of the Bank of Canada, the bank's policy interest rate now sits at 3.75%, down from its June 2024 high of 5%, signaling potential economic acceleration as these reduced rates filter through the economy. Looking at the unemployment and GDP statistics, one can conclude that the Bank of Canada's approach to slow the Canadian economic engine by keeping interest rates high coming out of the pandemic, did reduce inflation and ultimately achieved its objective. Regarding exchange rates, the euro is at 1.49 Canadian per euro and the US dollar at 1.39 Canadian per US dollar. It won't come as a surprise to you that a low exchange rate with the US dollar supports manufacturing in our highly intensive Quebec-Windsor corridor, where most of Canada's manufacturing and trade with the United States occurs. While this low exchange rate makes Canadian goods competitive in international markets, it does raise costs for imports to Canada. And finally, it won't come as a surprise to you, but Canada's top trading partner is the United States. That's followed by China, Japan, Mexico, and the United Kingdom. Both the United States and Mexico are key trading partners under the Canada-United States-Mexico Trade Agreement. And of note, Germany accounts for 0.95% of Canada's exports and 3.3% of its imports, highlighting a trade imbalance with higher value goods flowing from Germany to Canada. We'll talk more about that on the next slide. Next slide, please. Thank you. So Canada and Germany enjoy a robust trade relationship underpinned by the Canada-EU Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, affectionately known as CETA, which reduces trade barriers and promotes investment between the two countries. Germany is Canada's largest trading partner within the European Union. In 2023, Canada exported 7.1 billion in goods to Germany, while imports totaled 25.1 billion. Major Canadian exports to Germany include energy products, metal ores and minerals, which accounted for 35%, followed by consumer goods at 11.8% and electronics at 11%. Canadian companies such as Bombardier Transportation, Magna International, and Norbord, which was acquired by West Fraser Timber, operate in Germany. Conversely, Germany's exports to Canada consist of industrial machinery, motor vehicles and parts, and consumer goods. This reflects a significant value difference, with Germany exporting more manufactured and high-value goods to Canada when you compare it to the natural resources that are exported from Canada to Germany. Several notable German companies operate in Canada. Some examples include Bosch, Siemens, ThyssenKrupp, Volkswagen, Mercedes-Benz, SAP, Bayer, and Merck. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andre. But before we let you go, one word on the trading deficit, please. Canada has, as you pointed out, a large trading deficit with Germany. Has this always been the case?
Yes. So when I was looking at the data, I was looking at the 3-to-1 ratio that I was just speaking of, and this has been consistent over time. So the data on Statistics Canada's website shows us that that this 3-to-1 ratio has been constant over time. What is surprising is how much the trade volume has grown so much over those 20 years. So from an imports perspective, it's increased from 2.7 billion up to 7.3 billion. And then the exports have also from Canada have gone from 9.4 billion to 24.9 exports to Canada, I mean. So it's stayed steady from a trade deficit perspective, but the volume has increased significantly over time.
I see. Okay, well, thank you very much for that analysis. With that, thank you for your presentation. And I think we can now go to Jacques, who's now joined us. Jacques, we can see you there in the conference room. Hi there. I hope it's now working out all technical-wise. And we'd love to hear you now on your view of how the political landscape in Canada is affected by the most recent general elections in the US. Jacques, over to you, please.
Thank you. So, guten Tag, Damen und Herren. Ich freue mich, heute hier bei dir zu sein. Being in Ottawa, Canada's capital, I've been asked to provide a brief 8-minute summary on our Canadian political landscape. As my practice is often focused on advising Canadian, American, and European companies, this often leads me to share my thoughts on the political dynamics in Canada. I believe we all agree that we are witnessing today in North America and globally something that is quite remarkable. Hard to know where to begin, but I'll briefly focus on the positive opportunities to consider. And we have the first slide there. Justin Trudeau's federal government, a left-of-center government, has been in office since 2015. The government of Stephen Harper was defeated by Justin Trudeau in the sunny ways and sunny days theme. The Liberals came to power with much goodwill, great popularity, and a majority government. Since 2015, much has changed, and we see the Liberals in a minority government position. Much of its attention has been on climate change and social programs. While supported by the New Democratic Party, a left-leaning socialist-oriented party, it appears the next election will install a conservative government. A right-of-center party with populist views into power with its leader, Pierre Poilievre. Pierre Poilievre, a career politician elected some 20 years ago and at the age of 25. But when we look ahead, it appears that the look of the October 25 election coming up is one that will probably ensure that the Trudeau government falls. Nevertheless, we're seeing 4 opposing parties that might actually bring the Liberals down even earlier, but they're hesitant to do so, and frankly, Prime Minister Trudeau has no intention to step down, and certainly not before his preparation for the G7, which he'll be hosting in June. Canada has experienced impressive growth over the past 2 decades, but significant challenges lie ahead. Worthy to note that from 1995 to 2016, Canada attained the highest rate of GDP growth of any G7 country. That's 2.4%. If this would have continued, it would mean growth at this rate doubling every 30 years. And it's not happened for several reasons. There have been challenges to the very high quality of life that Canadians have enjoyed. And in a recent study by Boston Consulting, we see that Canada's strong economic performance has allowed the country to put off the need to address growth and productivity inhibitors that other countries have had to address directly. It is suggested that unfinished reforms would be required to boost productivity and deliver on big ideas and innovative solutions to drive growth, which must be pursued. The key threats, when we look at, are being addressed, though, and it is proposed that creating growth through opportunities, such as shaping Canadian cities into the economic drivers through investment in technology and urban development, is key. As well, transforming Canada's advantage of richness in vast natural resources, precious metals, significant oil and gas reserves, nuclear know-how, and hydropower are all components of our rich energy sector. I may add, the envy of the world in many respects. Furthermore, we realize it is critical to bring together marginalized communities such as Indigenous peoples and new immigrants into the economic mainstream, and then to maximize global flows of investment. To date, Canada has attracted good talent through openness to trade and immigration. We see great opportunities for Canada to lead in the fields of digital and AI technologies. These are not pie-in-the-sky ideas. The intellectual human resources required to advance our economy do exist in Canada and would be enhanced with the additional benefit of focused and strategic financial investments. We witnessed an example of recent investments in Ontario regarding EV and the efforts to expand on hydrogen energy initiatives following last year's visit of Chancellor Scholz to Canada. Overall, Canada seeks to further grow and strengthen its relationship with European countries. We can also point to the recent roadmap between Canada and Italy. Canada seeks to work with like-minded nations with the same shared values. While I would like to share some thoughts on recent provincial elections, I do not have a lot of time to do so. But I will say that we're seeing some changes towards more populist-oriented governments in our provincial elections recently. In BC, for example, we saw an almost even split between the governing New Democratic Party and the Conservative Party. Clearly, consensus government will be required there. In Saskatchewan, Premier Moe just brought in his right-leaning Saskatchewan Party with a majority. And in New Brunswick, the Liberals defeated the Conservatives, and a woman, Susan Holt, is now Premier with a majority. We're expecting provincial elections in Quebec and Ontario in 2026. The provinces of Ontario and Quebec are key engines of Canada's economy and will be important players in working with the federal government to engage in the new Trump administration. As well, the province of Alberta will play a critically important role with respect to the energy sector, particularly with respect to oil and gas, and the promotion of new methods to transport fuel to faraway destinations. Next slide, please. Vita. This leads me to the Canada-US relationship and President Trump's return to the White House in January. Suffice to say that people are worried, but many are cautiously optimistic that this new chapter on the Canada-US relationship will be positive and productive. During the last round of Trump's 4 years, it did not appear that the relationship was an endearing one between Trump and Trudeau, and we saw pressure in the context of the America First agenda. As a result, the government of Canada has over these last few months worked diligently to address any eventuality regarding the US election. A team comprised of key ministers, bureaucrats has been created to ensure a smooth relationship. Worthy to note, this saying in Canada that when the US sneezes, Canada catches the cold. Well, this is generally true with respect to economic issues in the United States. But at this time, it is my optimistic view that Canada will avoid catching economic pneumonia. I believe that we can and will succeed. All this is obviously important as we know that Donald Trump speaks of changing or ending the current free trade agreement between Canada and the US. The next round of CUSMA review will be in 2026, and my sense is that it is in America's interest for Canada's economy to be robust. Our senior politicians have given assurances to Canadians that we expect our strong and economically positive relationship with the US to continue. Naturally, the government would be put on a positive, or has to be put on a positive sentiment for the public. But I have no reason to believe that we will not succeed as appropriate steps are taken to understand the Trump administration's key objectives and work along with them. This morning, in fact, Trump had identified Ambassador Peter Hoekstra, former congressman from Michigan, who served as Trump's first administration as the ambassador to the Netherlands. So discussions are underway to embrace the opportunities that lie ahead by focusing on the continental economy in several sectors and the role Canada must play by maximizing on its natural resources and human capital. We will be obliged to take steps and increase expenditures in fields we avoided, such as increasing our military spending, securing the North, and moving away from some outdated public policies, such as the protection of supply management in the field of dairy products, which has been criticized severely by Americans. We will also need to revisit the extent of unnecessary regulatory burden, which exists at both federal and provincial levels. A former US ambassador to Canada confided to me last week that while many may say the sky is falling down, the reverse is much more plausible and likely, in that there are many reasons why Canada and the United States must continue to work hand in hand and make things together on both sides of the border, as we have done so well through previous decades. We have a border that must be secure but open to the legitimate movement of people, goods, and services. Canada is ripe for new investments and is a country that should be regarded by Germany as a serious business partner for commercial engagement into North America. It is a logical stepping stone into the United States, especially as we witness a level of uncertainty in the United States. Truly, I believe it's a perfect time to strengthen our bridge across Atlantic between Germany and Canada. Dankeschön. Last point, Canada will remain safe, stable, place to invest, and while we may undergo a change of government at the federal level, much of our day-to-day domestic lives are also run and governed by, in Canada, at the provincial level, all positive to consider through the turbulent times we may see over the next 4 years in the US and Mexico as well. So jetzt kann ich sagen, eine viele Danke. Dankeschön.
Well, dear Jacques, thank you very much, in particular for putting Canada forward as a destination for foreign direct investment from Germany. And you couldn't have put it any better and provided me with a better opportunity to lead on to the next part of our program, which is a sectors panel. We're now going to take a critical look at those sectors most relevant to Canada and the Canada-German relationship. And we've put together a panel of 5 lawyers from our offices in Toronto, Vancouver, Ottawa, and Waterloo. And they are Paul Harricks, who's a corporate counsel specializing on energy, nuclear, and infrastructure questions. Zonia Zietche. Zonia is a partner and leader of our Vancouver Life Science Group with a focus on intellectual property. And what's most notable about Zonia is that she has a diploma from the Technical University of Darmstadt and is fluent in German, but I assume, Zonia, you will nonetheless give your presentation in English. Apologies. We have William Bjornson for you. William is hailing out of Ottawa, where he specializes on all matters related to food, drug, and consumer products regulations. We have Viona Duncan from Waterloo. Viona is a corporate M&A partner and former leader of our technology industry group. And last but not least, from Toronto, Daniel Cole. Daniel is a specialist in advertising and intellectual property law. With that, I invite the 5 of you to give us an overview of your relevant industry sectors in Canada.
Well, thank you very much. I think I drew the shortest straw, so I get to start. So I want to thank everybody for joining us today and tell you what a great pleasure it is for us to present to you on all things Canadian. I'm going to talk about energy, and when I'm talking about energy in Canada, I'm going to talk mostly about the electricity sector. That's not to say that the fossil fuel world is not as important to Canada, as Jacques has already indicated. The fossil fuel sector is absolutely vital to our economic well-being. Canada, after all, has the 3rd largest oil reserves in the world, next to Venezuela and Saudi Arabia. And although some people might not like to hear about it, the oil and gas industry is going to be a very crucial part of our economy, I think, for many, many years to come. But I'm going to talk to you about electricity. And there are a few important points to remember if you're thinking of approaching the Canadian electricity sector or participating in it. First, Jacques indicated that a lot of the Canadian economy and the Canadian governance is at the provincial level, and electricity is a perfect example of that. Electricity, with a few minor exceptions, is not the responsibility of the federal government. Rather, each province and territory in the country has its own unique market for electricity, including its own regulatory regime. Secondly, a feature of the market, the feature of the Canadian landscape is that the provincial government itself is the owner and operator of not just the transmission system in most provinces, but also the generating assets. So in British Columbia, for example, BC Hydro, which is owned by the province, is really the only participant in the British Columbia electricity market. By contrast, next door in Alberta, there's a lot more private sector participation, which I think is a reflection of the political ethos of those 2 jurisdictions. Whereas here in Ontario, we have what we call a hybrid market with a very large generation company owned by the province of Ontario, but also a great many private sector participants in the generation market, the power producers. The other feature is that to the extent that power is transmitted across borders in Canada, for the most part, it goes north-south. That is to say, it goes into and out of the United States rather than east-west. There's been talk for many years about building an east-west power grid in Canada to link the country in much the same way as our railroads linked us historically. But that has not really come to fruition, and there's all sorts of geographic and, frankly, political barriers to that. I'd also want to mention that the different parts of the country are at very different stages in the so-called energy transition. British Columbia, for example, is, like Quebec, almost entirely hydroelectric or water power. Right next door, though, to British Columbia and Alberta, they are still very much a fossil fuel jurisdiction. That's hardly surprising, since that's where the Canadian fossil fuel production is primarily located. Further east here in Ontario, where I am, our largest province, we've taken ourselves off coal. We got ourselves off coal in 2014. It comprised about 25% of our generation. And we're now largely emissions-free in our electricity generation in the province. But that's down mostly to the fact that we have 60% of our power produced through nuclear, which I'll come back to in a couple of minutes. But obviously renewable power, and particularly wind and solar, coupled now with battery storage, is going to be the major growth area in the coming decades. Here in Ontario, we recently announced that the province is going to be procuring 5,000 megawatts of power, mostly renewables, in the next 2 or 3 years. In Quebec, they're looking at procuring up to 10,000 megawatts of power over the coming decade or so. And so that's where the growth area is. Alberta, too, is on a path to weaning itself off its fossil fuel reliance and building a lot more renewables. And German companies, I should say, have been part of the Canadian growth in renewables for many, many years. RWE is active here. E.ON are both significant participants in the Canadian landscape. So just a couple words about nuclear, which is a subject near and dear to my heart. I know we all know that Germany has turned off its last nuclear reactor, but Canada is very much in a growth phase when it comes to nuclear. Just last week, AtkinsRéalis, the major Canadian engineering company, announced that it's signed a contract to build 2 new so-called CANDU reactors, proprietary CANDU reactors in Romania. And in Canada at large, they're talking about both large-scale and small-scale, small modular reactor development. And the first commercialized small modular reactor, or SMR, development is in the world is outside of Russia, and in China is taking place right here in the province of Ontario. And I think everybody recognizes that technology is very much going to be on the forefront of the energy transition. But before I leave nuclear and turn it over to Zonia, I want to just point out that Canada is also one of the largest producers of medical isotopes in the world, and that's really down to our reliance on nuclear power. So with that, maybe slightly awkward segue, Zonia, I'll turn it over to you.
Vielen Dank, Paul. Thank you, Paul. I will give you an overview of the life science sector in Canada. So you might associate Canada with mining or energy, as just discussed by Paul. But Canada has actually quite a vibrant life science sector and a long and noteworthy history of life science contribution. For example, insulin was discovered in 1921 at the University of Toronto by Frederick Banting and Charles Best. And a bit more recent and quite fresh in our minds and also our bodies, the lipid nanoparticles that are used to deliver the Pfizer-BioNTech and the Moderna mRNA vaccines were actually developed by Acuitas Therapeutics, which is a spin-off company from the University of British Columbia here in Vancouver. So Canada's life science industry is a significant contributor to the country's innovation economy and encompasses a wide range of activities from research and development to manufacturing. So the industry players are small and medium-sized companies developing diagnostics, biopharmaceuticals, pharmaceuticals, and medical devices. But we also have global companies with research development and manufacturing operations. Contract service providers support the industry. And we also have quite a large clinical trial sector and manufacturing basis. The industry is mostly clustered in the metropolitan areas of Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver, where there are also research incentive universities, which result in spin-off companies from these universities. The key, obviously life science is a broad sector, but the key sectors in Canada are biopharmaceuticals and pharmaceuticals. So the pharmaceutical and medical manufacturing industry contributes about 82.5 billion to Canada's gross domestic production in 2023. Then we have the medical device sector. So Canada has over 2,000 companies in the sector, which focus mostly on medical imaging, cardiovascular devices, and robotic surgeries. And then our biotechnology sector has been substantially growing since 2019, with investments totaling 25.9 billion into more than 175 companies. Digital health is also quite big, with innovations in telemedicine, health informatics, and wearable technologies. Canada is also number one among the G7 countries in the number of clinical trials per population. Obviously, there's much more to talk about the sector, and I could go on quite a bit, but in the interest of time, I will hand it over to Bill now, who will give you an overview of the food and beverage sector.
Thanks, Sonia. So yeah, I'll talk to you a little bit about the food and beverage sector in Canada, focusing mostly on sort of food and beverage manufacturing, which is one of the largest manufacturing industries in Canada in terms of value of production. So our sales of goods in 2022 were goods manufactured were worth $156 billion, which accounted for 18.2% of total manufacturing sales and 1.7% of national gross domestic product. Food and beverage manufacturing has both provincial and a federal is subject to provincial and federal oversight. Once foods cross a provincial or national border, this is where federal regulation sort of kicks in. And so the food and beverage industry provides employment for over 300,000 Canadians, which means that, you know, Canada has a large knowledge base and labor force for entrance into the market. Within the industry, food product manufacturing is the largest sort of sector, which accounts for about 25% of the food and beverage manufacturing in Canada. But we have a diversified market, you know, which ranges from alcohol products, breads, sugar and confectionery, and obviously a large agricultural sector. Most of the food manufacturing takes place in Ontario and Quebec, which is where most of the sales take place, just simply due to population demographics. And Canada exports food products to almost 200 countries globally. But what's significant is that 77% of those exports are directly into the U.S. market. So there's quite a strong pipeline into the U.S. market out of Canada. As a sector, you know, it's a diverse sector with traditional food and beverage companies, a lot of food innovation. We see, you know, examples of German companies operating very successfully in Canada. Dr. Oetker, for example, has manufacturing here. I was on a trade delegation, a food trade delegation to Northern Germany last year, and you know, happened to visit a factory that was just around the corner from Dr. Oetker factory. So it's you know, not only a well-known brand in Canada or in Germany, but also in Canada, and so one of the recognizable brands operating here. And there's certainly room for more in Canada. And with that, I will pass along to Fiona Duncan to speak about technology.
Thanks, Bill. I think I have an interesting sector because, as you've been hearing from my colleagues, technology permeates every sector and obviously is a key part of the Canadian economy. In terms of quantifying it, it's quite difficult to quantify it from a GDP perspective, just because it hits every sector and there's users of technology and creators of technology. Canada has been described often as the Silicon Valley of the North, and that's really due to its number of innovative startups and also global multinational tech companies with significant operations in Canada. And I know we've heard earlier in the presentation, companies like SAP, Siemens, et cetera, all have been in Canada for quite some time and continue to access the highly technical talent that Canada has and a very strong R&D culture. Another thing that makes Canada extremely attractive from a tech perspective is that the Canadian government has provided significant financial support through tax and other incentives to make it attractive for foreign tech investment. Specifically, I was asked to speak a little bit about some of those programs or some of the things the Canadian government has done to support tech and innovation. For example, Canada previously created and funded what's called Global Innovation Supercluster Initiative. And that's resulted in growing tech innovation hubs and centers of excellence in major cities across Canada. For example, I know Jacques talked a little bit about government, but because that's the center where the Canadian government is, a lot of cyber companies and defense companies migrated to Ottawa to create new technologies and that relate to government. As well, Toronto has been a significant tech focus, including startup investment, and that's due to the VC cluster, and also has really been focused on, as well, the expanding fintech market with all the major banks there. And that's just to name a few. I wanted also to talk about what Canada has done. They've modernized and I guess further capitalized scientific research and experimental development, and those are called SHRED credits or tax incentives, and that's to encourage businesses to conduct research and development for eligible activities, and that's been a big driver of the innovation in the technology market. The government has recently announced the expansion of eligibility for clean tech manufacturing tax credit, and I think Dan, after me, will be talking a little bit more about that. Canada has also just announced an investment and partnership with a European company to advance 5G technology and R&D in wireless technologies in Canada. And as well, they continue to support AI, which of course is a major area right now. And there is a $2.4 billion investment in AI. And this investment includes building and deploying new AI solutions, research and development, supporting new innovative AI technologies, and really accelerating AI adoption in critical sectors that touch on tech, such as clean tech, healthcare, and manufacturing. But with that, we are seeing a lot of investment by European and German companies into Canada to take advantage of the innovation that's supported by government here. And we think that will continue to do so. And as others have said, Canada is rich for opportunity and continues to grow and expand in the tech area. I'm going to turn it over to Dan now to talk a little bit about manufacturing and also how tech and manufacturing relate to one another.
So just to give you a very brief overview, manufacturing is very much a cornerstone in the Canadian economy. Couple stats, 10%, about 174 billion of the gross domestic product, accounting for about 1.7 million full-time jobs. Canadian manufacturers export about 350 billion of goods. That's 68% of our merchandise exports. I think it's fair to say there's always challenges, right, in every sector: trade disruptions, global uncertainty, evolving regulatory landscapes, things you've heard about. But we are very much seeing these challenges present as positive opportunities for the Canadian market. So in the guise of keeping it short, I will talk very briefly about an area that's very near and dear to my heart, which is the automotive sector. This is where I spend the vast majority of my time. And we get the good fortune of working with many different automotive manufacturers, including Porsche, Audi, Volkswagen, Mercedes-Benz, BMW. And so if you were following the news today, you'll actually see mentioned that one of the big domestic free auto manufacturers announced a bunch of overseas job cuts. They ultimately are tying that to costs, right? But the one thing they did note was a need for more government incentives to offset the cost of manufacturing and purchasing electric vehicles. In effect, what they're saying, right, is it's too expensive and they can't compete with the China market. And so they're pleading with governments to make it easier for them to manufacture and easier for consumers to ultimately purchase. So we think this is actually one of the areas where Canada has very much excelled. I mean, you've heard a couple of examples of this. There are significant consumer incentives to purchase EVs in Canada, but the government also offers a number of key incentives to attract manufacturing to Canada. And so I'll give you a couple of quick examples of that. There's a net zero initiative, which is where the Canadian government announced its goal to phase out completely new gas-powered vehicle sales by 2035. That would be resulting in a net zero emission transportation sector. And then, as Fiona mentioned, the clean energy tax credit. This is the Canadian government offering incentives in clean energy incentives that provide 30% refundable tax credit in the case I'm talking about in the production of zero emission electric vehicles. So what we've seen is that these and other incentives are providing significant opportunity for manufacturers to invest in Canada. And in fact, since 2020, Canada and Ontario, which is where I call home, have attracted over $17 billion in investment by global automakers and suppliers of EV and EV battery materials. So I'll leave you with these two examples. Jacques mentioned one, but just a bit more detail. Volkswagen, through its subsidiary PowerCo, is about to establish an EV battery manufacturing facility right here in Ontario. It's anticipated that that plant will produce enough batteries for 1 million EVs a year and will be the largest manufacturing plant in Canada. And then recently, a Japanese automotive manufacturer announced that it will actually be building 4 factories in Ontario as part of a $15 billion investment in its North American EV manufacturing footprint. So I think it's fair to say to us, one thing is very clear. Canada and Ontario have become really top destinations for manufacturing investment. And I will leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Daniel. This concludes, and thank you to all the panelists giving us an overview of the different sectors. This concludes the first part of our program, Why Canada, it was entitled.
Yes, hello everybody, welcome back after this short break. After the, I found very interesting introductory session on Canada and its political and economical background and environment, I have now the pleasure to welcome you to part 2 of our session. Coming to Canada, and it will be about how does that work coming to Canada and what are the issues. We will kick that off with my partner Chris Andre. He's from our Waterloo office. He's a labor and employment partner who supports many international businesses operating in Canada with their people issues. So Chris.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Welcome to everyone. I appreciate you spending some time with us. Most of the businesses that are involved in international trade are going to involve having people on the ground, people in Canada. And so the purpose of this presentation is to give you just a very basic sense of things. The good news, I think, for most employers is there are no works councils. So I believe that would be good news for most. But one of the challenges is that the relationship is a contract. If you're familiar with the US structure and think that all North America is similar, we could not be more different from the US in terms of many of our employment and labor rules. So the relationship is a contract, which means neither party can unilaterally change the terms of that contract. Jacques and others talked about the different jurisdictions. Because we have 10 provinces and 3 territories, and 90% of the employment is governed by provincial legislation, as an operator in Canada, you can be subject to many different regimes, depending upon where you have people. If you've got a sales force in different parts of the country, you can have different individuals. If you have a manufacturing facility in one province and then in another, the rules will not necessarily be the same. They are likely to be similar, but they are not necessarily the same. A written agreement between the employer and the employee is not required. It is highly recommended because some of our common law traditions have resulted in quite generous employee-friendly outcomes in the court. Many of those rules, you can agree to a different outcome by contract. And so we tend to support businesses in the development of their written employment agreements as part of their systems when they're entering the country. There is legislation to promote the various social policy goals of the provincial government. So we have a minimum wage. You can see the number in Ontario. Social benefit costs are approximately 20%, so a little bit less than some European jurisdictions. There are maximum hours of work restrictions. Our vacation entitlements are dramatically less than some of your jurisdictions. So 2 weeks to start, 3 weeks after 5 years. And then, of course, we have very robust legislation, anti-discrimination legislation. In order to implement some of those social policy goals, governments can be very strict when it comes to certain things like workplace safety. So if there is a charge, a violation of the workplace safety legislation, the fines can be quite significant, up to $2 million Canadian for a violation. We do not have a national privacy rule the way that you have GDPR or in some other jurisdictions. So it is a patchwork of legislation and therefore can be difficult to comply when you have operations in different provinces. Disputes that arise between employers and employees, generally speaking, if the employee is not unionized, that matter typically would go to the court. If the employee is unionized, then that matter would typically go before a private arbitrator, or depending on the nature of the dispute, it could be a labor board. Next slide, please. For those of you who are involved in manufacturing, involved in bringing your technology to Canada, there are quite robust intellectual property rights. Generally, they are in favor of the employer, but you would want to have agreements to ensure that you protect what is important to you. There are also quite robust confidentiality rights for employers. There is fairly limited whistleblowing protections for employees. And so it is in many ways a good location when you are involving trade secrets. Intellectual property is a big part of your business. When it comes to terminations, it is simpler than many European jurisdictions, certainly in Germany, as I understand it, but it is typically more expensive. So if you do not have cause to terminate the employee, they have misconducted themselves in some way, the awards under legislation can be quite high, but even under the common law, they can be up to 24 months of pay to a long service older employee who is going to have difficulty finding replacement employment. And so it is important to have those written agreements to try to limit that liability to the degree that you can. A couple of other things that you should know about the market, like in many other jurisdictions, non-competition obligations are not enforceable typically. And in fact, at least in Ontario, they are illegal for most employees. Reasonable non-solicitation provisions can be enforced. The scope of those, the breadth of those is where you can determine whether it's enforceable or not. Just very quickly, some statistics on unionization. 19% is in the private sector. It's over 80 in the public sector. There can be multiple bargaining units in each physical location. So unlike a works council where you have one for the entire operation, you can have multiple bargaining units. And there is a trend right now in service sectors for more unionization. I've listed some of the names there. The last point I'll make is independent contractors, in contrast to employees, they are permitted, but we face some challenges if there is a misclassification. If you assess them to be an independent contractor and it turns out they are an employee, as the law would determine it, the consequence can be quite significant, the costs can be significant, and those are off-balance sheet liabilities. You won't know they're there until the decision is made and the court is enforcing the obligations. And so it's something that needs to be carefully considered, and obviously a written agreement as part of that process. So I will stop there. I will turn it over to my colleague, my partner, David.
Yeah, before we move over to David, allow me one question, Chris. So I'm just a corporate lawyer. So you've told us a lot of interesting stuff about employment law, and I learned that this is in Canada as important as in Germany, and sometimes even more important than corporate maybe. But just to summarize, what do your clients find to be the most challenging about managing people in Canada?
For foreign businesses, the assumption that Canada is one big jurisdiction. In fact, it is 13 separate jurisdictions. And so when employers come, they come with a view of how they want to do business. They can do business that way typically, but the challenge always is to ensure that you know where those employees are and you're complying with the legislation in the province in which those employees are working. In 2024, with more remote employees, it is that much more challenging because they may work in one province and live in another. So it can be a bit of a challenge, but that is one of the most difficult.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.
And now I have the pleasure of introducing my partner, David Petras, to you. I'd be more pleased that I can do this live and in color, as we said in German television in the 1970s. David is a corporate M&A partner and the Canadian leader of our European initiative. And David regularly advises on FDI into Canada. So welcome, David. He will talk to you about corporate structures.
Thank you, Lars. And I'm really sorry to not be speaking to you in German today. I've been trying to learn a little bit. I've been using the Duolingo app. And so far, I've learned sentences like, Die Eule ist schön. But I don't think that'll help today. So I'm going to continue in English. In Canada, we have a number of different corporate structures. See on the slide that we have limited partnerships. They're typically used for real estate and investment funds. We have unlimited liability corporations, so not limited liability, but unlimited liability. They are typically used for some Canada-US tax structures. So it's the one in the middle, ordinary business corporations, that we use the most often. There's no real equivalent in Canada to a US LLC, so we use these regular business corporations. They're like a US C Corp. And they offer limited liability, and the actors within those corporations are shareholders, directors, and officers. We can incorporate in any one of the 13 provincial and territorial jurisdictions, or there's also a federal business statute. You might think the federal one would be the way to go, but there's no particular advantage to that. So usually we find that German companies coming to Canada will incorporate in the province where they intend to locate their main office. And and I should say it's very easy to incorporate. Not a lot of information is required. It can be done quickly. If a corporation is incorporated in Ontario, let's say, but does business also in Alberta, then an extra provincial registration is required in Alberta. That's a straightforward filing, but it also requires the appointment of an agent for service in Alberta. And sometimes a company will have a representative who could do that, or sometimes it is a lawyer who will do that. And then there's an annual filing that goes with it. So we have some German companies that have incorporated and they operate only in Ontario. They don't need to worry about extra-provincial registrations. Others that operate across the country, and so they need to do that. Share capital, almost every company will have common shares, so they're voting usually. They have a right to whatever dividends the directors declare and the right to receive the residual assets. But then we can have preferred shares, and there we're limited only by our imaginations. They could be voting, have dividends, be redeemable, retractable, and so on. Shareholder agreement would be required if there's more than one shareholder. So perhaps a joint venture or similar arrangement where there's more than one shareholder. And there we would need to address how governance is going to work, who's going to be on the board, what happens in various capital transactions, if there is an offer for the company or right of first refusal, that sort of thing. Historically in Canada, it was impossible to know who the shareholders of a corporation were by doing a public search, but that is changing. In many of our jurisdictions now, there is a requirement to advise the government of shareholders in excess of 25%. And in some jurisdictions, that's just disclosed to the government. And in other jurisdictions, that's now publicly searchable. And it's a trend. I think we'll find that it will be possible to know shareholders in all jurisdictions soon enough. Directors are elected by the shareholders. Only the federal incorporation requires that any of those directors be resident Canadians. Otherwise, they can be from anywhere. And the directors are subject to two principal duties: a fiduciary duty, so a right to an obligation to act in the best interest of the corporation, and a duty of care, to exercise the care that a reasonably prudent person would exercise in the same circumstances. Next slide, please. Directors, sorry, back one, please. Yes, thank you. There are also specific statutes under which directors and officers have liability: environmental, health and safety, environmental statutes. And to deal with these liabilities, directors and officers will often want to see that director and officer liability insurance has been purchased. Officers are appointed by the directors. We usually have at least a president and a secretary, but you can have as many officers as you like, and they have the same duties as the directors do. If a new company is being established in Canada or a company is being acquired in Canada, we need to think about the Investment Canada Act. And if the value involved is above a very high threshold, then the government needs to review the transaction. If it's below the thresholds, then it's a simple filing to be done 30 days after creating the company or making the acquisition. There is an exception, though. If it's considered to be a Canadian cultural business, the threshold is only $5 million. And so in that case, review would be required. And there's more and more interest in national security everywhere, in every country, including in Canada. And so there's a broad power that the government has to review transactions, acquisitions. They're particularly interested, of course, in the country of origin of the acquirer and whether there's a sovereign wealth fund involved, and also whether it's sensitive technology, infrastructure, defense, cybersecurity, and so on. And finally, we have pre-merger notification if an acquisition is being made over the thresholds that you see on the screen. And that both of those thresholds have to be exceeded before review is required. And then the government could take 30 days or more if it's straightforward, and if it's complex, a lot more to approve or not. So just to conclude, it's relatively easy to get established in Canada through a new incorporation or by acquisition, but as you've seen, there are a few tricky areas to think about. Back to you, Lars.
Well, thank you, David. And being a corporate lawyer myself, I could have listened to this for hours.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Everybody says that.
Great. But putting myself in the client's shoe, my key question would probably be, how quickly can you incorporate a corporation in Canada?
It can be done very quickly. We, as soon as we have all the information we need, we can do it electronically in about 1 hour without any signatures. So it's very fast.
That's fascinating and much quicker than in Germany. Yeah, thank you, David. I have now the pleasure to introduce and hand the baton over to Carl Hinsman. Carl Hinsman is in our partner in our Toronto office. Carl is a income tax and structuring partner focusing on M&A, inbound investment, and reorganizations. Carl is a German expatriate and fluent in German, and he will talk to you about tax issues. Carl, over to you.
As David mentioned, for most German and European businesses that are going to engage in an active operation in Canada, usually the way to go is a Canadian corporate subsidiary. So I'm going to focus on Canadian corporate subsidiaries, particularly those that are subsidiaries of a German parent, and how they're taxed and how you get your money in and out of that subsidiary. So we just learned very quick to incorporate that subsidiary. First two things you're going to want to think about in putting that together is who's your shareholder going to be, and how do I maintain the tax residence as Canadian for that subsidiary. So in terms of the shareholder, generally the Canadian-German tax treaty is quite favorable. So usually you want to have the Canadian subsidiary be a direct subsidiary of the German parent. One of the issues we very commonly come across with a lot of European head offices is that Canada is often a secondary territory from an operational perspective to the US. And then often they've expanded the US, and it's the US that drives potentially the Canadian expansion, and the Canadian subsidiary is set up under the US company. But because the Canada-US treaty has some limitations on the ability to get into that treaty, where the US company is not ultimately US owned, it's actually a very bad structure. So when you're coming into Canada as a European organization, usually you want that ultimate owner parent to be the direct shareholder of your Canadian subsidiary. A second part is tax residence. So like Germany, Canadian law, you can have a corporation be resident in Canada, therefore taxable as worldwide income here, either by virtue of its place of incorporation or by virtue of its management and control, for which we usually look at the board of directors. One of the issues that potentially arises, particularly with Canadian subsidiaries of European parents, is that many European countries have a mind and management rule. And so if you were to stack your board of directors of your Canadian subsidiary with German directors, that may cause it to be resident in Germany or wherever else your majority of directors are by virtue of that. And now you've got a dual resident company, and there's no neat tiebreaker under the Canadian tax treaties with most of the German jurisdictions. So that can actually cause trouble. So ideally, you want to have a majority Canadian board of directors, notwithstanding our corporate law doesn't require it. And if you can't, for some reason, do that, which is sometimes the case, you just don't have senior enough people in Canada, there's ways to structure it otherwise, of just ensuring your meetings are there, just making sure that your mind and management doesn't end up in a different country other than Canada. In terms of tax rates, I think Canada's pretty competitive. Sort of the combined federal provincial rate is 23 to 27% in our most populous provinces. I think it compares relatively favorably to German tax rates. We don't have a Gewerbesteuer, so there's no variation by municipality, but for comparison's sake, for those who don't practice German tax, I think like in Frankfurt, the effective corporate tax rate is around 32%. So we're actually quite a bit lower than that. So the next part is you're setting up, you've got your shareholder, you figured out what your tax is going to be, how are you going to get money into your Canadian sub to get it to operate? So two principal ways. One is equity. We don't have any minimums or maximums like various other jurisdictions do. And then the other side of it is funding it via debt. So making a loan from parent to the subsidiary. There's a couple limitations. One is an older limitation, and the limitations really are around interest deductibility. So one is what we call the thin cap rules. Basically, interest is deductible only to the extent it's no greater, your debt's no greater than 1.5 times your equity. And equity can float around a little bit because it can include things like retained earnings. So you've got to be quite careful with it. And then we've got a new set of rules that came out about a year ago called the Eiffel rules. And while I understand the French have a very similar set of rules, I'm not sure it was intentional that Eiffel is that it's actually excessive interest in financing limitation rules. But basically that limits your deductibility of various financing expenses, including interest, to about 30% of tax EBITDA, which is a somewhat convoluted, varied version of what you would look at as accounting EBITDA, because it starts with taxable income and then has some computations around it. Next slide, please. So now, hopefully, you've got your Canadian subsidiaries making some money for you. So how do you get your money back out? 3 ways. So obviously, you can get capital back out, share capital, or contributed capital, or you can repay the loan principal. There's no withholding tax on that. Unlike some other jurisdictions, Canada doesn't have any rules about paying out profits via dividends before returning equity. So it's quite favorable in that sense. Interest payments, non-arm's length interest, so within a related party group, the base withholding tax rate's 25%, but under the Canada-Germany treaty, it's reduced to 10%. And with respect to dividends, similar base rate of 25% withholding, but usually reduced under the treaty, 5 or 15%. And the 5% rate to access that, the beneficial owner of the dividends got to be a company and it's got to own at least 10% of the shares. So for wholly owned subsidiaries, you're looking at a 5% withholding rate on dividends. So to touch on a couple other tax points, so if you don't set up a Canadian subsidiary, and maybe you're just doing a little bit of business in Canada, very common situation from a German perspective is manufacturers that are setting up equipment. Perhaps they've got some employees here for a slightly longer period of time while they're installing machinery, something like that. We have a withholding tax rules, what we call Reg 105 withholding. But basically, services rendered by a non-resident, so that would be a German company or any other non-Canadian company, when it's rendering services in Canada, the payor of the fees for those services required to withhold remit 15%. There are some ways to get around that by applying for a waiver in advance, somewhat convoluted, subject to certain limitations, but something to be aware of, particularly for German companies that are sending people over for those sort of slightly longer periods of time. So not a conference, but actually to work here for some period of months or even a little longer. And then the other sort of, I guess, the contrasting thing to a subsidiary is what if you just set up a branch operation? So your German company just, opens an office in Canada. So what happens? So once you have a permanent established, a fixed place of business like an office, that becomes a branch operation and it becomes subject to Canadian tax. And basically Canada taxes then the income derived from that branch. We don't see a lot of branches anymore unless there's a regulatory reason for it. And the principal reason why is it's very difficult to do the tax reporting for a branch operation, trying to actually allocate what income and what expenses are the branch and what is the main head office. And then as a last point, I guess, and to carry on with the theme of sometimes maybe this is just inferiority complex for the Canadians, but we always contrast ourselves to the Americans. So unlike the Americans, unlike much of the European Union, we have a value-added tax. Federally, it's the GST, 5% across the board in every province. We also have HST, which many provinces have adopted. And in Quebec, it's a QST. And then we have a couple provinces, with a sales tax, it's BC, Manitoba, and Saskatchewan. Overall, the combined sort of federal provincial rate ranges from 5 to 15%, so lower than most European jurisdictions. But another one of those things you really got to think about as soon as you are starting to engage in sales or delivering goods into Canada is, do I need to be registered? Do I need to be collecting these taxes? And they're often also one of the drivers why companies coming to Canada or entering the, selling into Canada. Everybody wants to start and sell to everybody. But it's often much simpler Chris talked about the employment rules are different from province to province. And another one is really the sales tax and VAT regime, because it varies from province to province. And so picking a couple of the more populous provinces is sometimes a way to get a feel for the regulatory regime rather than trying to register for every sales tax in every province right off the bat. And I think that's it for my part.
Well, thank you, Carl. I think that was very comprehensive and very interesting. I must admit the 70s TV show is a bit the leitmotif of this afternoon, and now it was the noise that was very similar to those old shows. I was therefore a bit distracted when you talked about repatriation of profits. Can you, you said you can do this by using dividends and interest. Are there any other means to repatriate profits?
So I mean, within a corporate group, those I guess would be sort of the true repatriation of profits. But within a group, there's often other ways that money is moved back and forth between the entities. Common ones are royalties for things like trademark licenses, right? If a Siemens or a Mercedes, right? The Canadian subsidiary for using that trademark usually pays a royalty, whether to the German company or sometimes those trademarks are kept offshore. And then another one is management fees. Sometimes you've got some back office functions or that are sort of centrally located somewhere else in the world, and so it ends up being an expense to the Canadian company, thus reduces its taxable income and puts that income into another jurisdiction. And all that said, is any of those amounts are also subject to our transfer pricing rules, which is for pretty much applies in any OECD country. So between related groups, you've got to pay an arm's length price. You can't just pick a high or a low number that you think would be good for your business. You've got to do an arm's length price, and you have to have support for it.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you, Carl. That was very helpful, I think. By the way, do we have any questions in the audience? Not in the room, I see, but no? Wonderful. Then I'm happy to pass on to Melissa to give this afternoon a bit of the French sparkle. Melissa is a partner in our Montreal office and leader of the firm's National Advertising and Product Regulatory Group, which is the largest such group in Canada. Welcome, Melissa, and Melissa will talk about the Quebec perspective, I think.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm happy to speak today about the Quebec Sparkle and some of the key differences in Quebec law that foreign companies should be mindful of when they're doing business in Quebec. And so I think the first thing to note is that the province of Quebec, or La Belle Province, as it's colloquially referred to, is the second most populous province in the country. It also draws its heritage from the French legal traditions from France, and therefore operates under a civil law legal system, which is distinct from the common law system that governs in the rest of Canada. And so we have the Civil Code of Quebec, which is essentially the cornerstone for this system. And I think we may need to move on to the next slide just so that, there we go. Beautiful Quebec flag. So talking about the Civil Code of Quebec, it's the cornerstone of our legal system. It codifies the rules and principles that govern private law matters. And so matters like contracts, property, family law. It's really the body of rules that sort of lays the foundation for all of the other laws in the province. And I think that can be contrasted against the common law system in the other Canadian provinces, which is much more based on case law or judicial precedents. And so while statutes do exist in the common law provinces, I think the courts rely a bit more heavily on past judicial decisions to set binding precedents. And so if we move on to some of the more specific legal requirements and statutes, you likely have heard of Quebec's French language laws. So Quebec has a long-standing statute that is called the Charter of the French Language, and the charter mandates French as the only official language of business and commerce in the province. It's been around since the 1970s, but was more recently amended starting in 2022 to further strengthen and protect the French language. And although French is the predominant language and cornerstone of our province's identity and culture, French speakers still make up a minority across the rest of the country. And so hence the emphasis on protecting and preserving the French language. So the Charter governs French language requirements pertaining to various spheres of life, government, and business in the province. It governs the language of education. It governs the language of contracts, labor and employment, customer service as well. And so Quebecers have the right to be served and informed in French. It governs the language of websites and corporate social media accounts. And so if you have a website or a corporate social media account, you are required to have an equivalent French version of that website or social account. And so typically that would be achieved with a toggle at like the top right-hand corner of your website, where consumers can kind of click to switch between the English and French mirror websites. The requirement to package and label your products in French is also grounded in the charter. And so the general rule there is that all inscriptions on a product, on its packaging or on its labeling, have to be in French with equal prominence to any other language, except for a few exceptions. And an exception that has been making headlines over the last few years is the exception for recognized trademarks, which I won't get into as our colleague Sheila will be speaking to that a little later on. So we talked about websites, contracts, point of sale materials and outdoor signage must also be in French, but rather than having to be equally bilingual, they actually have to be markedly predominantly in French. The same rule applies for outdoor signage. So think of retail front or storefront, commercial front signage. As of June 1, 2025, outdoor signage will follow the same rule for point of sale materials and kind of signage in general, which is that French has to be markedly predominant. And so what does that mean? It means that if you display a non-French or a German business name or trademark on your storefront or retail front, you are required to add French terms, descriptions, or even a French slogan that when you kind of take all of the French additional slogans, descriptions, whatever it may be that you've added, when taken together, occupy twice the real estate of your non-French business name or trademark. And so the requirement as of June 1 of next year will be that when you look at the Quebec landscape, French will need to occupy 2/3 of any kind of retail or outdoor front signage. And although there are penalties and fines for non-compliance, I did want to mention that the regulator is much more concerned about encouraging companies to comply as opposed to fining them. And so by their own data, the vast majority of complaints, I think it's roughly around 98% of complaints and enforcement are resolved without fines being levied. So they're not looking to fine companies for not complying with the province's language laws. They really are looking to encourage companies to do that. But then aside from the regulatory risks of non-compliant, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that French language preservation and protection is also very much a sensitive and political issue in the province. And so negative PR may result if companies fail or refuse to comply. If we move on to the next slide, please. I also wanted to touch upon Quebec's consumer protection legislation. Quebec prides itself on being a very pro-consumer province, and it has very unique consumer protection laws, including a ban on commercial advertising to children under 13 years of age. We're actually one of only 3 jurisdictions in the world that has such a strict ban on advertising to kids, the other 2 jurisdictions being Norway and Sweden. And so here again, you can kind of see that European influence come through in our legislation and our laws. And this is an important consideration for businesses that are involved in marketing and advertising of products that are either solely intended for young children, so think of the toy industry, but also manufacturers of goods and products that, while not exclusively intended for children, may still be highly appealing to kids. And so, a classic example of that might be specialty gourmet foods, these specialty German chocolates that we all love in Canada, or other types of products that not solely intended for kids, but very much appealing to children. The Quebec Consumer Protection Act also provides a legal warranty of good working order on all products that are sold to consumers in the province. And what that warranty of good working order provides is that goods need to be durable for a reasonable period of time, having regard to the price you paid, the use you made of the product, if you used it in normal use versus abused the product, etc. And so, for instance, a Gaggenau fridge, which is a luxury high-end kitchen appliance, may be expected to last longer than a lower-priced fridge or appliance. With that being said, though, Bill 29, which received assent last year, will establish a new legal warranty of good working order for a specific list of commonly used new consumer goods, appliances, electronics, etc., but the duration of which will be determined by regulation. So this is a notable departure from the current legal landscape, where the duration of that legal warranty is pretty much left up to judicial interpretation. Again, a Gaggenau fridge will likely be, per the courts, required to last you longer than a much less expensive fridge. And so instead, the warranty-specific timeframe will be formally established through extensive regulatory standards. And so we'll have to wait and see what those are, but those will touch upon household goods, tech and electronic products, to name a few. And so very quickly, the last thing I wanted to touch on is Quebec's Law 25, which modernizes the province's privacy legislation. And it introduced one of the most punitive privacy laws in the world, which was largely inspired but not identical to the GDPR. And without going into these specific legal requirements, I did want to mention that Law 25 introduces new data protection rights for individuals and imposes obligations on organizations that process data, such as mandatory impact assessments and privacy by default mechanisms. So overall, some unique rules and requirements, but also a unique culture and a great opportunity for companies looking to enter into the Canadian market. So merci beaucoup, Dankeschön.
Thank you, Melissa, for this overview. Very unique indeed. So I'm looking at the audience. Do we have any questions from the audience? Nor in the room, nor virtually? Then I do have many questions. As a simple Germanic corporate lawyer, this sounds all very complicated. Is it really feasible for a non-Francophone investor to invest in Quebec?
Oh, absolutely.
Assessment?
Yes, I think at first blush, the requirements may seem daunting, but it's certainly workable. And I think one of the major concerns that most non-French foreign companies are worried about are French language requirements, right? But for a German company that likely also does business in other markets and jurisdictions where there are French-speaking consumers, such as France, well, I think the Quebec French language compliance rules might not be such a heavy lift. It's also worth noting that Quebec is the second most populous province in the country. And so it will represent a substantial portion of the country's consumer base. And if you're looking to capitalize on the Canadian market, then I think that's definitely an important market. But I did want to give you one example. So a number of years ago, we assisted a European company, one of the largest retailers in the world with thousands of locations globally, in opening their first store in Canada. And for their first store, they actually chose Quebec. Brossard, which is just outside of Montreal. So despite the perceived challenges of doing business in Quebec, that particular multinational retailer chose Quebec for their first Canadian footprint. And so today they've expanded to upwards of 20 stores across the country. And I think that's just one example of a European company that entered into the Canadian market, Quebec specifically, and is enjoying great success.
Okay, well, thank you, Melissa. That's very reassuring. And thank you for that great contribution.
My pleasure.
Thank you. So we're coming to the end of the second part of this afternoon. We're a bit ahead of time.
Welcome back, everybody, to the third part of our program today. We now have a very exciting panel of speakers for you, both here in Frankfurt on site and virtually in our Canadian offices. This third part is dedicated to exploring building Canadian-German opportunities and protecting interests. And for this third part, we have not only Gowling speakers, but we've also have the great pleasure of having been able to secure the participation of some external speakers who you already can see at the front on the panel right here, but who I'm going to be introducing in a minute, if I may. But before we get to the panel and discuss with them investing in Canada, I would like to now ask to welcome Wendy Wagner from our Ottawa office. Wendy is the leader of the Canadian International Trade Group within Gowling WLG. And Wendy is going to talk about CETA and the importance of trade. And I dare say that's probably something that's of great interest to all of us, seeing what's on the horizon in the US and the incoming new administration. Wendy, over to you. Hi.
Good afternoon to all the attendees. I'm very sorry I can't be there in person and see all your lovely faces, but hopefully I can set the stage a bit for this panel by talking a little bit about the CETA agreement. So yeah, CETA stands for Canada-EU Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement. And similar to most trade agreements that you'll be familiar with, it does facilitate cross-border movement in goods, and it does that by reducing tariffs to 0 for 98% of all goods that are traded between Europe and Canada. But the comprehensive part of the title in the agreement is interesting because it's really considered a next generation type of trade agreement because it addresses a lot more than just tariffs on goods, which is really helpful in today's context because we don't just trade goods, we trade services and participate in procurement markets and other economic activity. So services is one of the areas that the agreement addresses. The statistic in the slide is actually incorrect. I think it was probably AI generated. We've actually done much better in the services area with the CETA agreement than is indicated here. So it's actually EU exports of services have increased 54% since CETA came into effect, and imports have increased 74% of services. And CETA really opens up the services market because it does something unique in trade agreements. It takes what's called a negative list approach, which means that all services sectors are covered by the agreement unless they're specifically excluded. And essentially, this means that neither Canadian or EU regulators are able to limit the participation of the other party in almost all services sectors like transportation, financial services, insurance, communication, a broad range of service sectors. And the trade and services is also facilitated under CETA by favorable business immigration rules that are also noted on the slide, and they allow for temporary entry of employees from the other jurisdiction and liberal issuance of work visas for business visitors and contractors and investors. So that's really helpful to that economic activity as well. The public procurement rules in CETA are among the most interesting because they allow European companies access not only to Canada's federal government procurement, but also to sub-central procurement, so procurement by the provinces and municipalities. And I'll just give one recent example of how this works or translates into practice. Transportation is a big area of procurement, obviously. And in a recent Quebec procurement of rail cars, the procurement requirements were set so that you had to supply rail cars that were either Canadian origin or European origin, because Europe is the only jurisdiction that benefits from access to the procurement markets of a municipality of that sub-central procurement. So, you know, a really concrete example of how EU companies can access our procurement markets. So I'll just ask you to move to the next slide. So one thing to note about the CETA agreement is that it's not static. It continues to evolve and adapt and grow. And similar to services, goods trade has increased more than 50% since the agreement came into force. And one of the areas in which it continues to grow or develop or be enhanced is in the mutual recognition of professional qualifications. And we've started in the area of architects. An agreement has already been issued. So you can see if you're involved in services markets in particular, how important it is to be able to have your employees or your expertise provide services within the other jurisdiction in that seamless kind of way. And professional recognition is really quite key to that. Another area where things have developed a lot or are developing is in the investment dispute resolution. That was quite a controversial part of CETA. Some of you may have heard the term ISDS, so investor state dispute settlement. It is something that's used rarely, and there's some measures that are being taken to help small and medium-sized companies have greater access to that dispute settlement. But really, you only have the ability as an investor to bring dispute settlement proceedings when the actions of the other country have been fairly egregious. One thing I just want to close on is, although ISDS is dispute settlement is not frequently used under the CETA agreement and is only available in those sort of more extreme cases, one thing we've really found in representing our clients is that we use CETA a lot as an advocacy tool to make sure that the regulatory environment within Canada remains favorable for EU access to our market. So there's been many circumstances where we've been able to counter a government proposal to adopt, unfavorable labeling regulations or other forms of non-tariff barriers based on the fact that there is this international trade agreement. And it's very helpful from that perspective. And from the Canadian government perspective, they're obligated to consider their international obligations under CETA whenever they're adopting a new framework of laws. So that's been helpful as well. So I'll end there and turn it over to the next speaker. And thanks for your time again.
Wendy, thank you so much. Before you go, maybe one question. You mentioned the advantages that European companies have potentially in procurement tenders, like in the transportation example you gave, I believe. Are there any other real life examples of European companies profiting and benefiting from CETA, potentially one that you've advised on that you can sort of tell us about to get a better understanding of what the preferred position is and the beneficial position is of European companies?
Yeah, nothing's coming to mind as a specific example, although in the procurement space, there have been many, just because it's opened up the opportunities so much at that subcentral level as well. So really, I think it's a matter of knowing where to find that information and access those opportunities, which is something that, we frequently advise on. And once you have that knowledge, and you have something to offer, you're pretty much good to go.
Well, thank you. That is very helpful. Thank you, Wendy. And this brings us now to the next part of this third part of the program, which is a panel discussion among three very esteemed gentlemen, two of which we have on site with us here today, and we thank them immensely for taking their time out of their busy schedules to be with us, and one dialing in virtually. I will start with Lucas Kirsten. Lucas, of course, is dialing in. You see him on the screen right there. Lucas is a vice president of the Canadian-German Chamber of Industry and Commerce. And with us here today are to my left and your right, I hope I'm getting this right, is of course, Dejan Velishkov. Dejan is a market director, Europe and UAE with Invest in Canada. Invest in Canada being a Canadian government agency promoting investments in Canada, as the name says. And to my father right, father left, your father right is Ernst Luger. Ernst Luger is a consul for economic affairs with Invest Ontario, also a government agency, this time of the province of Ontario, and promoting investment in Ontario. Lucas, Ernst, Dejan, you're here to talk to us about the benefits and the ways and means of investing in Canada. Who wants to start telling us what they are? Dejan, you potentially?
Thank you, Matthias. So, as you mentioned, we at Invest in Canada are a federal government agency, and then, as the name says, we provide direct support to global investors who are considering Canada for expansions. I am within a group that's called Investor Services. So we provide market intelligence, help companies with their investment analysis, guidance on some of the government incentives. And so they can kind of navigate the whole process in a more efficient manner. And then we work hand in hand with the different levels of government. And with Ontario, we had many successes in the past year. And what I would like to start with is maybe we can talk first about some of the general benefits and what we are hearing from the investor, etc. And then we can kind of go more into kind of more the incentives and what that government support is. But I think nowadays what we are hearing and what Canada has to offer, and it's becoming very attractive, is Canada is predictable and stable country, and within the current geopolitical context, having a country with predictable and stable policies, it is very in. So that's what we are hearing from investors. They like Canada because it has predictable processes. It's boring also on the regulatory side. It takes some time, but things are done and they're not shifting too much left or right or up and down. So I think that's number one thing that clients are providing feedback to us about Canada. I think the second part in this current context is Canada is very much towards adoption of clean technologies. And what really sets Canada apart, especially in North American context, is our focus and dedication to clean energy. So Canada overall has about 85% of our energy generation is emission-free. Energy is like a provincial, regional jurisdiction, and there are even states that have 100% renewable energy and industrial prices that are 3 to 4 times more competitive than Europe. So for a lot of processes that are energy intensive, name it in critical mineral processes, refining, specialty chemicals, and other, it is very important. And I was today here because of a food ingredients conference, and they're telling me even within the food industry, the carbon footprint of the ingredients is measured, and it can be an advantage for those that have the ability to operate in an environment where they have access to clean and affordable energy. I think that's really a major differentiator. I would say the second one we just heard from Wendy, and it's about the market access in the international context that companies operating in Canada take advantage of. Even in an environment, in a more unpredictable international environment, Canada is in a position where it has very reliable, strong relationship on trade in a North American context. It also has free trade with European Union, and in the last 30 years, it has worked tirelessly to form trade agreements with other countries in Asia and Latin America. So I think that's really, it has worked to future-proof for companies operating in Canada to have access without tariffs to other markets. I think that's, let's say, another natural advantage for companies. The third one would be the talent from different dimensions. First, talent in terms of, while companies globally are talking about talent crunch, it also happens in Canada, but we are hearing from companies that in a talent crunch context globally, it's easier to hire talent in Canada for multiple reasons. First of all, we have one of the highest percentage of educated people with post-secondary education. Second, the country is a magnet for international students to choose Canada because of the strength and the quality of the institutions to come and build their life after even studies there. And it is very open compared to other countries internationally for highly skilled people from around the world coming to the country. So that helps us in supply of talent in the market. Last year, I believe close to probably 500,000 people joined to live permanently in Canada. So that's when you compare how much percentage-wise is in a country, places like Toronto have about 50% of the population really not being born in Canada. So, and what I'm an immigrant myself, like new Canadian. So what really, it's a unique place where for people that are not there born, they're coming recently, they feel like belong there, and something works out well in society that everyone gets along well. I think that's really, really unique. But from a business perspective, it really doesn't add pressure to the cost of talent. So that's one way. So the talent can be hired, it's highly skilled, and it's more affordable compared to United States. So that's another one, and I maybe will just mention the other one. I'll let Ernst kind of from Ontario perspective share, and we can see even what Lucas can share with us from the feedback they're getting from their members from the chamber. I think the last one from my side would be government support for innovation and government support for the supply chains of the future.
Well, thank you very much, Dejan. It's very refreshing in this day and age and in this political climate to hear somebody talk about multi-ethnicities being an advantage of a country and in an economy, and also interesting to hear that apparently stability is the new black when it comes to the virtues of countries. And Ernst, I saw you nodding a lot while Dejan was talking. Do you care to expand?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to. So, I mean, Ontario, as over 40% of Canada's population, over 40% of Canada's GDP, everything that Dejan just said, it applies to Ontario as well. What I would highlight is something that Dejan mentioned right at the end there, which is innovation and supply chain. So what I think from an Ontario perspective is extremely attractive and very attractive to German companies is that, one, we know how to make things, we know how to make complicated things very well, and we know how to innovate. And you don't find a lot of jurisdictions that have that overlap. We've got the second largest tech cluster in North America behind only Silicon Valley, and we have the second largest automotive cluster behind Michigan. So you've got sort of, you know, the manufacturing prowess in automotive of Detroit with San Francisco's ability to create innovation, and that is a real selling point. And you see it when in the activities of German companies. We've got companies like Volkswagen, their subsidiary PowerCo, going to be making EV batteries in Ontario. It's going to be, when it's finished, the building will be the largest building in Canada. So that gives you an idea of the scale of that investment. But on the sort of innovation side, Mercedes-Benz announced earlier this year that they were going to be opening up innovation incubators in 3 locations in Ontario to scout talent, to scout tech, to scout innovation. So I think that those 2 examples from massive German companies that are well known for making things and innovating, and that's a real vote of confidence and a real show of, I think, our ability to provide those attractive things to German companies in particular.
Well, thank you, Ernst. Lucas, this brings us to you. What is your view? What is the view of your members on investing in Canada and on the benefits of investing in Canada, and how the Canadian government, both on the federal level and on the provincial levels, support that?
Sure. Thank you, Matthias. And thank you in general to the BUJ and to Gowlings for having me today. It's always a pleasure to be a part of events like that and to share how we as the Canadian German Chamber support Canadian and German companies. Before I answer your question, I think it might be a good idea to give a brief overview about what the Chambers of Commerce abroad in general do, and maybe in particular the Canadian-German Chamber. I think it is safe to assume that all of you have somewhat of an idea what the Chambers of Commerce and Industry in Germany do, the IHKs. However, when it comes to the Chambers of Commerce abroad, I think like fewer people know of them and know what they actually do. So as the name implies, Chambers of Commerce abroad were implemented to support German businesses and German trade abroad. And I think the first one was founded in 1894 in Brussels. And as of today, we have 150 locations in 93 countries. So Gowlings, you have a bit of catching up to do. The Canadian, or the Chambers of Commerce abroad in general are subsidized by the Federal Ministry of Economics and Climate Action, the BMWK. Even though we are just subsidized, we are not fully funded. The kerfuffle, the word that you learned in part 1, is affecting us. The kerfuffle that's going on in Berlin at this moment. So I had a difficult time convincing our board that I could fly to Frankfurt because I would have loved to join in person, but it's webinars for now. And yeah, so in Canada, we opened our first office in 1968 in Montreal, but today we have an office in Toronto, and we serve all of Canada from coast to coast to coast. And our mission is exactly what this part 3 of this event is about. It's about building Canadian-German opportunities by supporting Canadian and German companies in Canada and in Germany. And so what do we do? We have, in total, we have 3 core functions. First of all, we are the official representative of the German industry. So we tend to use a sentence, I actually wrote it down because I can't remember it. And if you ask me, it sounds a bit pompous, but it is that through us, the German industry speaks locally with a consistent voice perceptible to all stakeholders. What does that mean? So what I mean by that is that we use our unique position to try and promote favorable business environments in Canada and in Germany. And our second role is that we are a member organization similar to the IHKs in Germany. However, it's not mandatory to be a part of the Canadian-German Chamber if you want to do business here. However, obviously we have a large network and we can help members reach potential partners and increase their visibility. And we organize about 40 events and delegations every year. For example, next year to the Hannover Messe and hydrogen hubs. So it is obviously a good idea for a new company in Canada to be a member. And the last role is that we are a service provider. So we offer something that we would like to call the one-stop shop. So if a German company wants to come to Canada, we try and provide everything from pre-market check, market research, business partner search, over incorporating what you heard from David, and payroll, bookkeeping, and all of that. And in that, we work very closely with experts like Dejan and Ernst, or firms like Gowlings for that matter. So I think this is enough background to just for the people that were not familiar with what the German Chamber does. And back to your question, I think I wholeheartedly agree with what Dejan and Ernst just said. So just in general, we would say we see lots of opportunities for German companies. You've heard today that Canada is one of the largest economies in the world with stable economic and political conditions. I think Dejan just called it boring. Let's call it stable for now. The location is perfect to access global markets. The sustainability goals are comparable to Germany's. We just heard that some of the provinces are completely net zero already. So that offers lots of opportunities for cooperation. One point that I don't know if that was made clear, I think Todd in part 1 mentioned, I mean, obviously he mentioned that we bring exceptional talent regarding ice hockey to Canada, but I think we are connected by much more than that. I think when you look at our cultures, our values, we are very connected, and that makes us like-minded partners. And lots of German companies express exactly that when they come here. It's for a lot of people when they come here, it's a home away from home relatively quickly. And yeah, I mean, you've heard the Volkswagen investment from several people already. I think especially in the last couple months or maybe years, the already close partnership has been intensified. The 4 billion euro investment with the Gigafactory is one, but there are a few more. Linde, for example, has a $2 billion investment to provide clean hydrogen. K+S is investing 3 billion euros in Saskatchewan, and I think that is public information. They articulate themselves similar to Dejan. I don't think they said boring, but they're somewhat excited about the less bureaucratic ways of doing business in Saskatchewan. One investment I'm slightly skeptical about, let's put it this way, is that the Deutsche Bahn signed a multi-billion euro contract for the extension and maintenance of the local transit system here in Ontario. And well, let's see how that goes. Yeah, I could share some example of our members who have been successful here, did the jump across the pond, but I want to be mindful of the time. You let me know. It's the first hybrid event I'm doing, and it's a bit difficult to pick up on social cues because I can barely see all of you. So just tell me to stop talking or keep going, whatever you want.
Well, thank you, Lucas. I'm not. I don't mean to stop you from talking. I'm just saying thank you for that. But we've been talking about Canada being an anchor of stability on the North American continent. Now, if I may, I want to pour a little water into the wine, if I may. We all know the US has had general elections and new administration is coming in, but the US are not the only country to have general elections in the foreseeable time. Canada is, as I understand, due to have general elections at the latest, if my lawyer tells me correctly, by October of next year. At the same time, I understand that there is a bit of a, well, not concern, but it's absolutely in the air that the federal government and the composition of the federal government may change, and may change dramatically, not least because there's also a certain sentiment in the Canadian general population towards the right end of the political spectrum. What does all of that have to can tell us about the stability of Canada, and do you see anything that people ought to be aware of in that respect? I don't know who wants to go first, because this is a potentially more challenging question.
Yeah, I'm happy to give it a shot. So I would say that one thing that the boring nature of Canada also connotates is a stability and consensus across major political parties. I think that a good example would be the Ontario government right now is a conservative government. The federal government is liberal, but the cooperation is extremely good. You regularly see and hear them complimenting each other, particularly when it comes to measures that are intended to support businesses. So there is, I think, this broad-based consensus that regardless of who's in charge, who's in power, making sure that we have a competitive, internationally attractive economy is going to be one of the highest priorities of whoever's in government. And I just don't see that changing. One of the reasons I don't see it changing is that anytime even the opposition now at the federal level, they don't criticize the approach of the current government when it comes to economic policy, especially when it comes to, well, when it comes to economic policy, yes, but when it comes to dealing, for example, with foreign investors, some of the support that's been put in place, some of the work that's been done with companies coming in, you'll hear some comments maybe around the margins of, well, is that really the most efficient way to do that? But there's no broad-based lambasting of these kinds of investments. So I would say that makes me quite positive that even a change in government at whatever level would not bring with it a massive change in approach.
Dejan, you share these views?
Absolutely. I think the collaboration between the current federal government, which is on one side of the political spectrum, especially with the provincial government in Ontario, together, the collaboration and the one team approach, you can appreciate some of these companies and some of the decisions that, especially with German investors that that Lucas mentioned, they need the investors and executives of these companies need some convincing stories to be told to make those decisions. And I think Canada has not always been able to convince, but also to deliver with kind of working together. And I think I'm not a political analyst. I advise on investments companies, but what I can say, one way to predict the future is if we look in the past and in the history, and then if we do that in Canada compared to some other countries, we can see that I agree with Ernst that we are a predictable place. When things come, people work, drinks the differences for the best interest of the country, and this has consistently been happening and being delivered in Canada.
All right, let's go to Lucas because he's the objective observer. Lucas, are these two gentlemen right in their assessment?
Unfortunately, I left my crystal ball at home. But however, the only thing I can add to that, I do agree with both of them. The only thing I can add to that is that we didn't hear from any of our members that they're worried about what is going to happen in the future, which was different a couple of years ago, the election in the States, where we had several companies saying that they didn't feel comfortable anymore in the States and they were planning on moving north. And let's see what happens from that point of view in the next couple of months. But yeah, no, we didn't hear any worry.
Okay, thank you so much. I would say then, unless any famous or infamous last words, we continue with the program. Dan, looks like you want
I would like just to add one more thing. I think based on maybe what happened in the past on the North American continent, or recently we have seen in the past years a change of trend of how Europeans but also German companies think, and on how what they do when they try to kind of expand over the pond. The change in behavior, in the pattern of their behavior about investment is changing. In the past, it used to be you're thinking about North American market, you're setting up operations in North America, going to United States, and then we'll think about Canada, Mexico, what else is there. What we are seeing now with this establishing of new supply chains, Canada having like-minded economy and values like Europe, you're seeing these companies making one first-of-a-kind investments and going Canada first when they're thinking about North America. And I'll end it with that.
Well, thank you very much, Dan. That's a good final statement. We're now turning changing the perspective, and we're turning to Peter Misek. Peter is joining us today via Teams as well. Peter, you are a managing partner with Framework Venture Partners, and I think you have stories to share with us on what it's like as a Canadian investor investing in Germany and the types of experiences you've had in those endeavors. Hi.
Hello. Why don't I spend 15 seconds giving a little bit of background framework? So we see 1,000 companies a month. We track 50,000 companies across North America and Western Europe. And I've been doing this full-time and part-time for over 25 years. So it's been a lot of fun, and I feel very privileged to do that. So thank you for having me. As far as doing business in Germany, we partner with a fund called DN Capital. It's actually co-headquartered in Berlin. I love the Berlin ecosystem. I really dislike the corporate loopholes I have to jump through to invest in Germany. The whole power of attorney postulate is an absolute misery. It creates huge friction and complexity. And if I could make a suggestion, please find a way to modernize that. That is a relic of a long time ago. And if you found a way to modernize it, you would find more capital flowing into Germany in a big way. Berlin is a massive
busy
tech
taking
hub.
notes here.
Yeah, Berlin is a massive tech hub. We have two investments, a company called Scale Hub and a company called Hypatos. And Hypatos is a world leader in document AI and LLMs, and will come into companies and reduce costs by up to 95 to 99%. So it's pretty phenomenal tech built in Berlin.
Okay, so other than the need for getting rid of laws on the powers of attorney, what else is your specific experience in investing in Germany? Are there any benefits to it? I mean, in the end, you did it, didn't you?
Yeah, massive benefits. Very, very high technical skilled workforce. The universities are wonderful. The average education is higher than North America. The number of PhDs I run into in Germany, I don't know if it's double or triple what I run into in North America, but it's much higher. And particularly in AI, when you want to be able to have auditability, transparency, and data compliance, I think they're world class. But I want to point out that the vast majority of revenue for these companies actually derived in the United States. So even though the tech is built in Germany, I'd say forged in Germany, the market really does shift very quickly to the United States.
Okay. In your view, what should a German company do, no matter what their size is, or maybe it may very much depend on their size, in order to make themselves attractive for Canadian investors?
The big thing is revenue growth is going to be a huge driver. Absolute revenue levels and unit economics. So how do you acquire customers profitably? And then to make yourself attractive is having a great go-to-market strategy. And I think go-to-market is a challenge that both German and Canadian companies face. All of our successful companies struggle at some point with go-to-market in a big way, so sales and marketing. And for that, we would strongly recommend getting as many Americans involved in the go-to-market as possible. They're just much better bullshitters than the rest of us, so get them involved.
Again, duly noted. But still coming back to the sort of particularities or peculiarities of Canada, Canadians, and what they're looking for, and we've heard a lot about stability and of being boring almost being a virtue, and I can absolutely subscribe to that. Is there anything particular that Canadian investors look for other than other investors might look for? Is there any particular way in which companies that do meet these requirements can make themselves known to Canadian investors?
Yeah, the big way to get known is your marquee customers receive testimonials. Testimonials are the number one way that we scout and find companies. So just to give everyone an idea, there's roughly 2 million software companies on the planet, just over 1 million in North America and about 500,000 in Western Europe. And to stick out and to stand out, you really, really need testimonials. Have your customers willing to talk about how it was to work with you, what the value you did. As an example, for Hypatos, we had a customer come out and say that they actually reduced costs in accounts receivable and accounts payable by 95%. The moment that they did that and they stood behind that, sales exploded upward for the company. So please, please, please get testimonials.
In your view, does it make a difference whether a company is already themselves invested in Canada for it to be attractive to Canadian investors? In other words, is there some sort of reciprocity in the sense of that?
No.
If they're willing to invest in Canada and if they're willing to thereby demonstrate a certain amount of stability, that's a virtue that we're looking for.
No, our world is much more chaotic. Stability is more transient in our world. A company will be top of the world for a period of time, and then all of a sudden a new large language model or generative AI will come out and eviscerate them. So stability is something far less we look for. We look for what we call technical development cycles, the speed at which you can add code, the speed at which you can release product, the speed at which you can adapt to market conditions and competitive responses. That's the most important from a technology and product perspective we look for. And that's what German companies seem to be actually really good at.
Thank you. You know what? We'll stop right here because that is exactly what we wanted to hear. Thank you very much, Peter, for being with us and sharing your wisdom today. I would now like to hand over the baton to the head of our intellectual property department here at Gowling WLG in Germany, my colleague Mirai Kavruk. Mirai, over to you.
Thank you very much, Matthias. And being an IP lawyer, I can't help but say, and I'm sure Sheila will agree, save the best for last. So we're coming to I'm IP, and I have the great pleasure to introduce Sheila Carnegie to you. Sheila is an IP partner based in our Toronto office, and she is the co-head of the firm's global intellectual property practice. Sheila, it's great to have you with us, and I'll hand right over to you, and we're all excited to hear about IP in Canada.
Thank you very much, Mirai, and I hope you can all hear me. Guten Abend. And congratulations on making it to the very last formal presentation of today. So as Mirai said, I'm Sheila Carnegie, and it's my pleasure to give you a very quick and very high-level overview of IP protection in Canada, and it'll please you to know it's not all that different than Germany. So first, let's talk about patents. As you probably know, patents are a statutory and territorial right, so protection in the US or the EU is not going to extend to Canada. A patent grants exclusive rights to an invention that's new, useful, and inventive, and it gives the patentee the legal authority to prevent others from making or selling the invention for up to 20 years in Canada. In exchange, the patent applicant must publicly disclose how to use the invention. So the concept of novelty underpins patent protection everywhere. If the invention is disclosed before the patent is filed, the patent may not be valid. One important difference between Germany and Canada and the US is that under Canadian law, you have 1 year from the time of the earliest disclosure to file that patent, and it's still valid. In Germany, subject to a very narrow 6-month exception for exhibitions, any evidence of public disclosure at all will invalidate that invention. So top patent holders, as I'm sure won't come as any surprise to you, in Germany include Bosch, Siemens, and of course the automotive companies like Mercedes, BMW, and Volkswagen. And where patents protect the functionality of an invention, industrial designs, which is what we call them in Canada, protect a product's unique appearance, such as its shape, its pattern, or its ornamentation. In Canada, industrial design registration provides for a maximum of 15 years of protection. You can get similar protection in Germany for up to 25 years. It requires some renewals. And it's particularly valuable for businesses in the consumer goods field. So furniture, jewelry, graphical user interfaces, purses, and shoes, and it safeguards that unique aesthetic appeal. Some of the top holders in Canada that you'd be familiar with include Apple, Lululemon, General Motors, and Harry Winston. Trade secrets, as again, you're probably aware, are a form of IP that protect confidential information that has commercial value derived specifically from remaining a secret. Formulas and processes fall into this category, and some of the most famous trade secrets in the world are, of course, Coca-Cola's formula and the delicious Kentucky Fried Chicken recipe. Unlike, and so the value of a trade secret is that it can be indefinite protection as long as it remains a secret. What this group might find interesting is I recently attended a panel of in-house counsel in Detroit for all of the automotive companies and their suppliers. And they indicated that they were increasingly interested in trade secret protection because they were concerned about the use of AI by their inventors and what that might mean for the validity of their patents. Before I get to my favorite topic, trademarks, I'm just going to touch on copyright. It's very similar to Germany. Copyright in Canada protects original works like literary, dramatic, musical, and artistic works, and lasts for the life of the author plus 70 years. Protection rises automatically upon creation, so formal registration is now required in Canada to enforce rights. However, we do have a body that does register copyright here, and it's deemed presumed evidence of copyright protection. So it's very useful in any dispute. I just want to briefly touch on the impact of AI on the validity of patents and copyright. In Canada, this is still somewhat of an open question, but it appears to be trending in the direction that while a human being must be listed as an inventor or the creator of copyright protected works, AI can be used as a tool so long as sufficient human direction was involved. That appears to be the way that it's going. And lastly, I just want to talk a little bit more about trademark protection in Canada. And I'm doing that because I'm a trademark lawyer, and also because every company that comes to Canada has at least one brand. So as you're likely aware, trademarks can take many forms, and you can register many of them in Canada, including words, logos, sounds, scents, textures, holograms, moving images, and even the shape of a product if it has sufficient reputation. The trademark is protected only in association with the specific goods and services that it brands. So BMW and Porsche are for cars, not applesauce, and Adidas is for clothing and shoes, not Kentucky Fried Chicken. An important feature of Canadian and US regimes, I think it's similar in Germany, but it's different in many different places in the world, is that common trademark rights can arise just by virtue of using a trademark. And these are, we call them common law rights in Canada. And they give the user the exclusive rights, but only in the geographic area of their reputation, and only to the extent that they can prove an exclusive reputation in that mark for those goods. That's great. You can come here, you can start doing business, and you may obtain some rights, but we always recommend seeking registered rights and not relying just on your use. And registration does come with a host of benefits, two of the main ones being that you have automatic nationwide protection and enforceability in your brand if you get a registration. Several of our speakers talked about the sheer size and scale of Canada. So you can imagine if you're only using your brand in Toronto and someone copies it in Vancouver or Halifax, you can rely on a registration to enforce your rights in that brand and prevent them from using it. But if you don't have a registration and you have no use or reputation in Vancouver or Halifax, you're not going to be able to stop them, and you're going to lose that exclusivity in Canada. And registrations also allow you to take advantage of what I call some free enforcement mechanisms. We have a customs assistance program that you can register for to prevent counterfeits at the border. You need a registration to apply for that. And at least an application is required to take advantage of some online takedown platforms like the Amazon brand registry. Fortunately, you do not need, unlike the US, you do not need to prove use to obtain a registration in Canada. So you can seek protection years and years before you get here. And in this way, you sort of plant a flag on our registry, and the Trademarks Office will block any confusingly similar marks that are filed after yours, and they'll do that for you. But it's notice to the industry that you're coming and that you intend to use your brand here, and that alone will scare people off. Trademarks are registered for 10 years, and they're renewable indefinitely so long as you continue to use them. In Canada, if you fail to use the mark for 3 years without an excusing circumstance, we can have it canceled off the register on a summary basis. In Germany, I know that period of time is 5 years. Before registering your trademark, we strongly recommend that you conduct availability searches in Canada. These look for potential obstacles and red flags and can help you maybe readjust your branding strategy before you get here and before you spend money on applying to register the mark. And lastly, I just want to touch on Quebec. Melissa mentioned that I would be speaking about this. As she mentioned to the group, everything in Quebec has to be translated into French, subject to some exceptions. One of those exceptions is a recognized trademark. A recognized trademark does not have to be registered, but it's much easier to deal with an angry regulator if you can waive a registration at them. And the way that it's going to work as of June 1st, 2025, with the new law that Melissa was referencing, is that on packaging and labeling, even if you have a recognized trademark, any words that are considered descriptive or generic in that mark still have to be translated unless they are the primary brand of the product or a designation of origin. And for signage, which is treated differently than packaging for some reason, recognized trademarks are exempt. You don't have to translate the descriptive or generic wording, but as Melissa was mentioning, you need to give twice the space to the French text as opposed to the German or the English text. And that wraps up our intellectual property review. So thank you very much for your attention this late in the day.
Thank you very much, Sheila. I think that was That was very comprehensive. And indeed, as you said, the systems really are not that different. And I think what the systems also have in common is that the protection is of equal importance. So if you have maybe 1 or 2 more minutes, I would like to touch upon one of our favorite topics, probably the trademarks. We both know about the importance of trademarks when it comes to protecting your products or a company's name. About it has a high importance and value for a company's reputation and market recognition. So Sheila, the question to you is, what 3 things should a German company think of before introducing a brand in Canada?
So I'll just, in the context of how boring we are as Canadians, which we've heard several times, we also have some very enterprising Canadians that will look at the EU and the US and see what's popular, and they will register your brand before you get here. So those ones are slightly more exciting. Because of that, I always recommend do your availability search, know what's on our register already, and apply early. It's taking our trademarks office 4 years to get to registration. So you have many, many years to get yourself on the register, plant your flag, and I could delay it as well, so that you're holding your spot and you don't have that problem with people looking across the border and seeing that you've got a popular new product and applying to register it here. That's just a headache, as you can imagine. And so do an availability search, apply early, and if you're going to be operating in Quebec, you're going to want to lock down what your packaging and labeling has to look like. With all of these, there's an exception for trademarks, but then there's exceptions within there, and it's not an easy landscape to navigate right now. And we can certainly help you do it. So those are the 3.
Thank you very much. I'm just looking into the audience if there are any questions on this so exciting topic of trademarks and IP. Guess not, maybe later on, but thank you very much, Sheila. And looking at the time, I'm handing over back to Matthias.
Well, thank you very much. I think there's not very much left for me other than to ask everybody here in the room to give our panelists a hand maybe for the time and the wisdom that they share with us.